Welcome everyone to today's show. Is this labor's big moment? On today's keynote, we'll discuss work, labor, and employment in America with our panel of leading reporters working in this field. Viewers, I want you to please join me in welcoming today's guests. We'll start with Eleanor Mueller, who is a labor reporter for Politico and Politico Pro. She covers labor politics and policy with a focus on legislation. Eleanor has written extensively about paid leave and childcare, as well as unions, unemployment insurance, and other labor-related issues. In the past, she has reported out of newsrooms for CNN, McClatchy, USA Today, and others. Lauren Cowrie-Gurley is a senior staff writer at Motherboard, which is Vice Media's tech site. There, Lauren covers the intersection of labor and technology. Her reporting has also been featured in the New Republic, the New York Review of Books, In These Times, and the American Prospect. We have Noam Scheiber, who is a Chicago-based reporter who covers workers and the workplace. Before coming to the New York Times, he spent nearly 15 years at the New Republic magazine, where he covered economic policy and 3 presidential campaigns. We have Paige Smith, who is a labor and employment reporter with Bloomberg Law, where she covers a range of topics related to employment law. Paige also covers the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Labor Department's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. And finally, on the academic research side, we have Alexander Colvin joining us, who is Dean of the School of Industrial and Labor Relations here at Cornell University. Dean Colvin's research and teaching focuses on employment dispute resolution with a particular emphasis on procedures in non-union workplaces and the impact of the legal environment on organizations. So audience, yes, we will be having a group discussion here, but we are as interested in your input, your questions, and your comments. So please, in the top right of your video player, open up that chat dialog box. You'll see lots of action in there. Submit your questions. I'll be getting them here. So we'll take your questions throughout. We are live, and this event is also being recorded. So if you have to leave at any point, you can access the recording several moments after we're done in just about an hour. And of course, you can share this live keynote or the recording with friends, colleagues, family. It's free and open to the world, so you can share this URL as you see fit. So with that out of the way, every day, we're seeing increasing reporting on the shifting dynamic between American businesses and their employees, with workers apparently gaining an upper hand. Workers have had time to reflect on their quality of life during the pandemic. Workers are demanding more pay and more equitable conditions, while employers' power appears to be waning. Dean Alex Colvin, I think we'll start with you. What's going on here? How do you see this playing out in the near and long term?
Yeah, I think we are seeing a combination of some long-term trends and some perhaps surprising shorter-term things. So we were seeing a longer-term trend. If you look at all the labor market indicators, we had a long, slow but steady recovery of the labor market after the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. If you look sort of the 2010s, things were just gradually getting better and better for workers over time. And as we got to the more recent years, you started to really see wage growth picking up as some unemployment got to really low levels. That was also a period when you start to see more worker activism, pushing for higher minimum wages, the fight for 15, teachers going on these unexpected strikes, I think, in the Red for Ed strikes. And so you had these long-term trends. Now, then you got this short-term shock of the pandemic, which normally you'd think in a sudden recession like that would really kill worker power, that you'd really see with these sudden rises on unemployment, that things would really go badly. But things really haven't worked out quite the way we'd expected. And maybe there's a couple of things there. We had much more heavy government intervention in the economy than we've had in the past. So that's sort of massive stimulus, I think, having an effect. But there seems to be something kind of different about what's going on with this pandemic that are affecting how workers are thinking. That sort of fear of the danger of the workplace, I think, is affecting things. How people are thinking about work is different. So there really does seem to be something different going on right now, that's interacting with these longer term trends.
Noam Scheiber, are you seeing the same thing that Dean Alex is seeing here? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I see some similar developments. Certainly, the short-term labor bottlenecks. We hear a lot about employers struggling to fill jobs, particularly in the service sector, hospitality. So that certainly is giving workers leverage. We're seeing wage increases as a result. And I think it's fair to assume that some of those short-term effects will persist over the long term. We know that the wage at which you're hired at initially serves as the floor, and then you tend to get increases on top of that. So I think we'll see some long-term trends that are favorable to workers that come out of this moment. I'm somewhat more skeptical of the other long-term trends. Prior to the pandemic, there were a number of things that were diminishing or even undermining worker power. The most obvious being the decline in the rate of unionization. Private sector unionization in the last few years has been around 6% of the entire private sector labor force, which is microscopic. And even as we saw some of the developments that Alex mentioned, the Fight for 15 and Red for Ed, the teacher walkouts, we didn't really see that translate into greater union density. We'll talk about labor law later, but there are a number of sort of structural reasons why that hasn't translated into higher union membership, and we haven't really fixed those structural reasons. A number of other long-term trends that I think will probably reassert themselves pretty soon, where employers push work out of their company, out of the core into the periphery. So you get more outsourcing, franchising, those kinds of arrangements. And we know that those tend to diminish wages and reduce worker power. We've seen proliferation of other institutional arrangements, non-competes, which make it harder for workers to leave one job and get another. And that's typically how workers get raises. We've seen mandatory arbitration explode in the last decade or two. And again, very hard to make kind of long-term progress if you can't bring a class action lawsuit, say, against an employer that may be systematically stealing wages from you and your coworkers. So I think a lot of long-term developments will still kind of loom over the relationship between workers and their employers. And it's not clear that those are going to be affected by the kind of short-term increase in leverage that we're seeing.
Yeah, going back to unions, let's talk about policy and initiatives coming out of the White House. How might one characterize the Biden administration's relationship with unions? Like we could talk about what we're seeing unfold with legislation like the PRO Act. Eleanor Mueller, any thoughts on these?
Yeah, so the PRO Act, or the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, was actually passed last session. It was never taken up in the Senate. Republicans pretty much unanimously oppose it, but Biden came in hot with unions. He came in with the support of pretty much every national union in the U.S. He has 4 decades of relationships with these union presidents from his time as a senator and his time as vice president. And in the days leading up to the election, we were writing our pre-writes and getting a lot of comments like, Obama was labor friendly in title, but Biden gets it in a way that Obama never did. So I think they had a lot of high hopes, and definitely, if you ask Richard Trumka, you ask anyone, their highest priority is getting the Protecting the Right to Organize Act passed. The bill would basically make it easier for workers to form unions, including by expanding the right to collective bargaining to independent contractors, and actually giving the National Labor Relations Board the ability to levy fines, which they don't have right now. So yeah, it would be the biggest reform to U.S. labor law since 1947, which is pretty significant. But we are, the House did pass it again this session, and it has since kind of gotten stonewalled in the Senate. It has the support right now of 47 Democrats, so they don't even have, all 50, let alone the 60 it would take to overcome a filibuster, which it would need to do because it doesn't qualify for budget reconciliation.
Yeah. Lauren Gurley, let's kick it over to you. I know you have some thoughts on the Biden administration and unions. Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
I was just going to piggyback off of what Eleanor said. I basically agree with everything she said. 2 other things that the PRO Act would do that are pretty significant are that it would repeal right to work laws, and which exist in 27 states at this point, which make it obviously really hard to to build unions and build union power because workers aren't paying dues in those instances. And it would also outlaw captive audience meetings, which are a tool anti-union employers use, basically just like anti-union meetings that are compulsory that workers have to sit through that, and down in Alabama recently, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but Amazon workers were listening to, 6 of these hour-long meetings. So it definitely, I think, is like Eleanor was saying, a policy that would really serve to like give workers a lot of power that has sort of been whittled away at since the Reagan era, and the ways that different states have passed laws that have made it a lot harder for workers to unionize. I think I specifically covered the gig economy and Amazon, and I think for gig workers, obviously this would be a big deal because they could unionize right now. They're as independent contractors, they cannot. And then in terms of Amazon, which is like a big deal in terms of, the union election that just went on down in Bessemer. I read something, a couple of labor lawyers wrote about like what that election would have looked like if the PRO Act had passed, and how it would have been much more likely that the union would have won for some of the reasons I just outlined. But
yeah, I think Amazon's a great example of what the PRO Act would do, because so much of what Amazon did in that election was a bit of a legal gray area today. But if the PRO Act had been passed, it would be outright legal. So,
right. Go ahead.
I think it's a good illustration of, Biden can say that he supports organized labor as much as he wants, but unless they can manage to pass something like the PRO Act and actually codify some of these things, it's hard to imagine much changing.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, even if it doesn't pass, I think the business community is very worried that certain parts of it could be revived and, legislated on a different level if the act itself doesn't pass.
Noam Schreiber, I know you wanted to follow up on this one. Any comments?
Yeah, I agree, almost with pretty much everything Eleanor and Lauren said. I do agree with Eleanor that, we're in this weird moment where Biden is clearly, the most pro-labor president we've had in generations, probably since Roosevelt and Truman. And unions recognize that. They give him great credit for his comments during the Amazon campaign, for example, where he said, basically employers should not intervene and should not intimidate workers, and workers should have the right to decide for themselves. That was, a really welcome statement from organized labor. Even Obama was not nearly so explicit in his support of labor. But as Eleanor said, you do have to ask, like, if you're, it's basically impossible for you to pass pro-labor legislation through the Senate because you don't have 50 votes, much less 60 votes. You have to wonder, what the actual legacy of this administration will be on the labor front. I think one irony is, the one place where I could see an actual practical impact that would, potentially create hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of new union members is, some kind of deal with the gig companies where labor would accept a status that's less than full employment, some kind of contractor, glorified contractor status, in exchange for a bona fide labor organization. Right off the bat, that could create a few million new union members across the country. But that, becomes very controversial within the ranks of labor and on, in the Democratic Party and on the left generally. So the one thing that could be a real practical, step forward in terms of union membership and union density is the one thing that the Democratic Party probably can't agree on. So even that gets tricky.
Yeah, I see several nods in agreement from the panel here. Let's go back to that vote in the Bessemer that took place. Lauren Gurley, let's review this, the Amazon vote. This was back in May, if I'm not mistaken, in Bessemer, Alabama, at a fulfillment center. What do you think what happened at Bessemer means for future wide-scale organizing? What were some of the takeaways from that, from where you sit?
for those people who weren't paying attention or maybe want to recap, it was just that, I think there was a lot of attention put on this election. It was maybe probably the most high profile union election of my entire lifetime. And so I think for a lot of people, it was a big surprise that they lost so badly. The warehouse had 5,800 workers and less than 1,000 voted. I think around 700 voted for the union. And so they got about around 30, might get that wrong, I think less than 40% of the vote. And so, I think generally when you see a loss like this, it's very discouraging for workers. But I think in this instance, it really wasn't, because just taking on Amazon, the fact that, this is the first union election at an Amazon warehouse in U.S. history was, for a lot of people, a victory in itself. Some people might disagree with that, but, you had, I think, over 1,000 workers reaching out to our WDSU, which was the union that organized the drive, interested in how do I organize my workplace? Now you have, campaigns going on, Teamsters leading campaigns. Teamsters came out yesterday. The Amazon, the director of Amazon at the Teamsters came out yesterday, I believe, saying we're really interested in, we're putting resources behind organizing Amazon. SEIU is putting resources into organizing Amazon. You have sort of drive going on that's being led by workers in Staten Island and New York City. You have other sort of grassroots worker-led movements going on in Chicago and Sacramento and Queens and New York. So a lot of stuff is going on. I think that also extends beyond Amazon itself, the number of people who are inspired by this. I think the confusing thing here, right, is there's all this enthusiasm, but that sort of and this larger cultural shift and people really supporting unions, the material reality isn't there yet. And so I guess it will be interesting to see what happens.
I should know.
Sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Add something really quickly to what she's saying about not materializing. I mean, we did an analysis of how many had petitioned the National Labor Relations Board to formally form a union. And there were actually fewer petitions in Biden's first 100 days in office than there were in Obama and Trump's first 100 days in office. So when you think about it, that's kind of crazy. And we talked to union presidents who said that part of that is because they're organizing outside of the formal process. But still, exactly, given the rhetoric, you would not expect that we would see a dip.
Yeah, very good. Dean Alex held a conversation back in May on this very thing, right? I think Dean Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but it preceded the Bessemer vote. And it was a big tech and labor focused keynote. So I think we're going to try to drag up that URL, and hopefully my partner Katie can share it with the audience so they can catch up on some of that. Again, it was before the vote, so it was a bit of a shocking next day.
So don't be misled by the optimism of the organizers that I was interviewing. They were trying to work hard for their election, but I think it does change a little bit how we think about things. I think the thing to look forward to is, as we said, these other organizing efforts. The one in Chicago is one I'm keeping an eye on that I think could be quite interesting, and to see if there's more success in a more labor-friendly location. You still sort of think of Amazon warehouses as a natural target in the sense that they are large establishments. They're relatively fixed in space. They're not going to be offshored, so they're a natural target for the unions going forward. So I think it really is kind of a good test case of can they actually succeed under the current regime.
Mm-hmm. Dean Alex, let's stick with you, actually. So let's talk about some other Biden economic policies that can have an impact on labor as we emerge from the pandemic. One
of the other things is actually, I think, picking up on something Noam said earlier, that I agree with his pessimism about the chance of structural changes. There's various structural headwinds that labor faces right now because of the way the rules are structured, and it doesn't seem very likely that we're going to get these changes in the rules, as was noted about the PRO Act limitations. So some of the bigger changes may actually be the impacts of things that aren't directly regulating labor. The sort of macroeconomic things, having Jay Powell stay in the Federal Reserve and keeping loose monetary policy may have bigger impact. And then the other one that jumps out to me is what's going on in terms of trade policy, which seems pretty interesting, that there has been less change in trade policy so far under the Biden administration, even being, a more multilateral focused president, which may reflect, I think, essentially that Trump, to a degree, kind of gave up on the Republican Party position on trade and adopted the congressional Democratic position, which was skeptical of trade and wanting stronger limits on trade. So, that I think is going to be really interesting going forward to see whether that continues to be the case, that we keep a more cautious approach on trade than certainly Obama or Clinton had done in their administrations.
Noam Schreiber, do you have a follow-up to what Dean Alex just said there?
No, I agree with that. I think they are looking for levers that are outside the traditional kind of NLRA regime. There are other things, other levers they could pull. The NLRB has the right to cede jurisdiction to states in certain circumstances, and you could see experiments with what's called sectoral bargaining if the board were to do that in certain states where there's been some organizing around that, Washington State, maybe California. SAU is very creative. The service employees are very creative at kind of thinking outside the traditional NLRA regime, and you can imagine them trying to work with the Biden administration to create some incentives for healthcare, home health workers, home aides. The HHS Medicaid program has a lot of money that they can give to different states, and they can attach conditions to that money. And so you could require sort of a sectoral or industry-wide bargaining for a state to receive that money. So we could see different kind of experiments outside the kind of traditional NLRA framework, beyond what Alex mentioned, trade and even some of the stuff that we saw in the rescue plan. They spent tens of billions of dollars shoring up union pension funds, which was from the perspective of unions, long overdue. So there are definitely other levers. I'm sure we'll see some of it if they pass an infrastructure plan. There'll be probably a prevailing wage provision that's tied to green energy jobs. There are definitely other levers to pull.
Yeah, I think that's right. That one of the really striking things is that a lot of the pro-labor action is really been coming at the state level. California, New York, these states where labor has more influence are starting to get more action. Washington too. And one of the questions will be, I think, if the Democrats at the federal level sort of essentially lose hope of federal level action, and so do take a more state-centric approach of sort of passing things on to the state, right? You can imagine other areas too, like antitrust law right now limits some of what states can do, and are they going to relax that? That might be something you could get around in a way that it's hard right now with labor law to do. So, I think the states are really worth keeping an eye on.
We have a good question from viewer Zach related to, Noam cited green energy, or mentioned green energy there. Viewer Zach asks, one major area for potential union growth is establishing labor standards like prevailing wages and project labor agreement requirements to do the work in developing green energy and other projects in the proposed infrastructure plan. Does anybody want to comment on those measures that I've just mentioned there? Any thoughts on that? That's a jumping ball.
I can jump in on that. I mean, it's clearly, something that Biden has talked about. So far, I think only 2 states have passed prevailing wage legislation when it comes to green jobs. New York just did recently, and I think Connecticut has too. Illinois may do that in the next few days. That's certainly, when we talk about this transition, the decarbonization, and, Biden has a goal of totally decarbonizing the power generation sector by 2035, which would mean, hundreds and hundreds of utility scale solar and wind farms. And that's a lot of construction jobs. So there's certainly, trying in the legislation that's moving through the House and Senate now to write prevailing wage laws that would boost pay for construction workers in those areas. I suspect there's going to be some industry opposition to that. So we'll see exactly where it lands and kind of how limited it is or circumscribed it is. We also don't exactly know what a prevailing wage would mean. You know, we know what a prevailing wage is for like an electrician or a carpenter, but I don't think, I could be wrong. I don't think DOL has like a prevailing wage for like a solar panel installer. So where that's set would matter a lot, you know? But yeah, it's clearly a priority for Biden and something that the unions are watching really closely.
Lauren, I'm going to kick it back over to you and ask you. So let's shift gears a little bit, right? We talked about unionization for a moment there. Let's get back to your gig workers I mentioned from earlier. So what's ahead in the battle over gig workers' employment status? What can we expect in this space? How will it impact workers, consumers, business, others who may be concerned? What do you see with gig workers happening now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think just one thing to note is that during the pandemic, a lot of people started working jobs in the gig economy after they were laid off or unemployed. So there was a lot of attention put on that. On the federal level, I'll just like quickly note that, you know, the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, had, you know, sort of deep ties to Uber and Lyft and other gig economy companies in Silicon Valley that oppose reclassifying gig workers as independent contract or as employees, which is the big question here. But it seems, and like Biden has so far come out, you know, in support of reclassification. The PRO Act, which we already mentioned, one of the pillars of it is ABC tests that would reclassify gig workers such as Uber and Lyft drivers as employees, which would give them rights to like unionize. In May, Biden blocked a Trump-era rule in the DOL that made it easier to classify gig workers as contractors under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I think it came out yesterday that he intends to nominate David Weil, who has supported sort of crackdowns on gig economy models that use independent contractors. He would be running a division within the Department of Labor that oversees gig workers' rights. So that is a big deal. I think really, though, where our attention should be focused probably at the state level. For those of you who've been paying attention, I believe it was last week. I mean, most recently, the attention has been on New York, where there was a draft of a set of laws that would have sort of carved out an alternative path for gig workers to unionize, not as employees, but with some of the rights and benefits of employees, like I think retirement contributions and a process for sort of contesting the terminations or deactivations, as they call them in the gig economy. And this arrangement would have created 150,000 new union members in New York, I believe. And it was, you know, very controversial. A lot of labor unions and labor activists opposed it. There is a group in New York City called Los Deliveristas Unidos that has been sort of grabbing a lot of attention recently and building a lot of power. They're e-bike delivery drivers or delivery app workers in New York City, and they opposed it as well. It's sort of similar to what happened in California last year, 2020, with Prop 22, where, you know, gig economy companies like tried to find a sort of alternative pathway where they wouldn't have to reclassify workers as employees, but still give them sort of some concessions. And so I think that, you know, we're going to end up seeing more of that. That's something definitely to pay attention to. I believe there was a similar bill that was shut down in Connecticut's legislature. So yeah, even though some of these have died and California's went through, I think it's definitely a thing to pay attention to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren Gurley. You know, I feel like there's more to revisit there regarding gig workers and the gig economy, but I am anxious to bring Paige Smith into the conversation. We've got 28 minutes, and here we go. Paige, so I want to ask you, so we're going to shift gears to talk about racial, gender equity, civil rights related issues. So from where you sit, you know, what are the priorities for workplace civil rights agencies at this moment?
Thank you. I think I would also give just sort of a moment to reflect on where we are in this current moment in history, which is, I think that for a long time, companies were sort of given I think they were sort of permitted to sort of pay lip service, if you will, through diversity inclusion initiatives. And now at this moment in time, workers are much more keenly aware of the fact that, they are, I should say this, they are much more aware and are willing to hold companies accountable for any sort of diversity inclusion focused statements. So in terms of priorities for workplace civil rights agencies, there are sort of two primary workplace civil rights agencies that workers can turn to, which are the EEOC, where it's sort of the first stop before a worker sues their employer, and then a division within the Labor Department called the OFCCP, which oversees sort of employees of federal contractors. And the Biden administration has sort of turned towards both of those agencies as a way for workers to as sort of primary agents for workplace civil rights. So I think that really some things to kind of keep in mind at this time is that both of those agencies are really expected to receive pretty big infusions of cash as compared to the past administration. And that's a big deal because, this will really help them more effectively enforce their missions of workplace civil rights. In particular, depending on what happens with Biden's jobs plan, but it does tentatively give the EEOC an additional $1.5 billion over the next decade on top of sort of standard appropriations. So that would be a really big chunk of change for this sort of, in the grand scheme of things, relatively small agency, and it could help them carry out a number of initiatives. And specifically, that money is sort of tagged to support longer-term approaches. So that would be towards dealing with sexual harassment, protections for LGBTQ plus folks, discrimination generally, and pay equity in the workplace. So there could be a number of developments over the next decade if that comes to fruition. Another really interesting thing to kind of keep in mind is that the two heads of these agencies, both of whom are women, have indicated that they really want to focus on addressing systemic racism in employment, which has been sort of long, it's been, I don't want to say it's been underappreciated, but it is really now thrust into the spotlight at this moment in time. And so Director Yang at the OFCCP has said that she's really focused on closing existing racial and gender pay gaps. So that's kind of an area to watch out of the OFCCP for contractors and their employers. And I should note that, I think the number is 25% of the entire workforce in the U.S. is employed by a federal contractor. So it's a sizable number of the U.S. workforce. And then Chair Burrows of the EEOC has said that she's also really focused on addressing and carrying out racial justice initiatives, but also focusing on the pandemic's unequal economic fallout. So some really interesting things to keep in mind there for those workplace civil rights agencies.
Dean, Alex, do you have a follow-up to this? Yeah,
I think Paige is exactly right that this is an area where we really do see some of the wind behind the sails of change in this area, and we see that in terms of the employer responses that corporations, even if it's rhetorical, maybe do feel the pressure that they have to be rhetorically supportive of anti-discrimination efforts, and so this is different from the organized labor setting. I think that we do see more of that concern, and that probably reflects more robust laws in this area, but also societal pressures. If you look at kind of attitudes that really have changed in the area of civil rights in the workplace and discrimination areas, I do think there's going to be some battles over the next couple of years under the administration. I think adequately funding the agencies is a really big change. They've been chronically underfunded for years, and so that's a big change. But there are specific things. Mandatory arbitration is one of the big defensive tactics that employers use today. And I think there's going to be continuing battles over that. It may or may not be something that we see congressional action on. I think that it's an uphill battle, but I'd say it's more likely than the PRO Act being passed by quite a significant margin, right? Because I think there is more pressure behind it. So I think this is going to be a battleground the next couple of years.
Switching up policy, proposals, Eleanor Mueller, I want to return to you and ask you what you are seeing with paid leave, childcare, family-related policy proposals. What are you seeing now, and what do you see coming down the pike in the near term?
So Biden campaigned on making childcare more affordable and on 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave for all workers. It's right now the U.S. has 12 weeks of unpaid family and medical leave for certain workers, and we're actually the only OECD nation, so the only wealthy nation that does not currently have a federal paid leave policy. So it's pretty, I think that there's a little bit of uncertainty, but for most intents and purposes, he is the first sitting U.S. president to call for a national paid leave policy. And he actually put out a blueprint of how that would be accomplished in his American Families Plan. So that bill would not only give billions of dollars to supporting childcare wages and childcare facilities, but it would also create a national paid leave program within the Treasury Department. I think that this is something that in so many ways, we saw COVID exacerbate and underline these issues that have been longstanding in the U.S. economy. I had a former advisor to the Trump administration tell me that it would have saved the U.S. as much as $1 trillion to have a national paid leave policy in place before the pandemic hit. So, I think this is something that people are realizing, especially post-pandemic. It's not just something that people like unions want. It's also something that makes economic sense. So we'll see. Employers, I think, are more open to it than they have in the past. I've spoken with people at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce who have told me that, well, this is something that has never been on the table for them. They are now open to talking about it, but a lot of it will depend on whose pocket the pay is coming out of, exactly whether or not it preempts state and local level regulations. I know that is a huge thing for a lot of employers. Is for them, the biggest draw is basically whether or not a national paid leave policy would what's the word? Having a stroke, would preempt, that's the word, state and local level policies. Because right now, especially after COVID, we saw a dozen states in the District of Columbia enact their own paid leave policies. That's total. So if they may have had one before, but yeah. So I think it's something we're seeing a lot of momentum for. Whether or not it's something that they can get bipartisan agreement on is a different story. They would be able to pass it via budget reconciliation, but they'd have to leave out a lot of policies that would leave out disproportionately low income and workers of color. So it's a lot to weigh, a lot of it in the air right now, but definitely I think they have momentum on their side when it comes to that specifically.
So we are in a post-pandemic return to work phase. Paige Smith, I want to ask you, how do you see employers and workers and the return to office policies taking shape, right? So we've got vaccination policies in place, mask mandates or lack thereof, safety concerns, things along those lines. And how do you see some of the return to work policies, playing out on the federal, state level? What kind of legislation are we seeing? What's happening there?
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing, honestly, has been watching the agencies try to respond to this sort of unprecedented, I'm sorry, I hate that word at this moment in time after it's been used repeatedly, but truly, it's been really interesting seeing these agencies try to respond to this moment, because there's been such an appetite from both workers and employers to just learn as much as possible. They just want answers from their state and local governments and, these agencies that provide guidance for this moment in time for the pandemic. And it's been really interesting watching them try to scramble and keep up. And it's not that they are not wanting to respond. It's just that these, hurdles that are being thrown up have not been dealt with before. And the delay, again, I can't stress that enough. The delay in response times isn't necessarily because they don't want to weigh in, but it's just because things are happening so rapidly. So I've done some reporting, for example, on vaccine incentives, and that's been an area that, employers have sort of forged ahead with offering incentives for workers to receive vaccines because they want their workers to be vaccinated against COVID-19. But it was really it was a legally gray area for a number of months. And, across the US, employers were offering incentives, sort of large and small, for workers to encourage vaccinations. So it's been really interesting to watch the EEOC respond to that, and sort of that play between employers and workers and the agencies. And just watching that play out has been really interesting.
Eleanor Mueller, any follow-up to that one?
Nothing beyond, I think, what Paige said. I mean, she's so right. So much of this is a gray area. I think that, again, I don't think the Biden administration has been dragging its feet per se, but I do think that, Marty Walsh, he's a very middle of the road guy. I think that he did not want to do anything that would risk screwing over employers who are looking to come back from a recession. Businesses have kind of been flying blind, but we got the thumbs up from the administration that incentives were okay. I think most people are still steering clear of mandates, although a federal judge earlier this week did rule against hospital workers who sued their employer for mandating vaccines. So it looks as if the law could be on the side of allowing employers to mandate that their workers get the vaccine. But definitely a gray area, and definitely something that I think we'll just have to wait to get more clarity on.
Yeah. Go ahead, Noam.
Just jump in here for a second. Yeah, I agree with what Paige and Eleanor said. I think the one interesting, kind of politically interesting aspect of this is just last week, I think we saw kind of the first, jostling between labor and the Biden administration over the rule that OSHA, which is the worker protection agency within the Department of Labor, put out. Biden, during the campaign, had committed to doing a broad set of regulations to protect workers from COVID in the workplace. And he sort of doubled down on that after, shortly after his inauguration, signed an executive order ordering OSHA to basically start preparing a rule. They finally drafted that rule and sent it for regulatory review, and it kind of languished in the regulatory office for weeks and weeks. When they finally finalized the rule, it was not a broad set of workplace rules. It was only a rule that covered healthcare workers. A lot of other high-risk industries, manufacturing, meat processing, retail, they were not covered by the rule. They'll just be covered by recommendations. And you saw unions respond very kind of quickly, bitterly, vocally, saying that this is a broken promise. Biden said that he would do this rule that would protect all workers from COVID. And even though vaccination rates are going up and infection rates are going down, you have a lot of workers who are still vulnerable in these industries like retail and meatpacking. It's far from a huge fissure between labor and the administration, but it's really the first kind of big issue that we've seen Biden get crosswise with labor on. And it'll just be interesting to see how that plays out going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Noam Schreiber. And on top of it all, now we have a worker shortage, right? So what exactly is that about? What's the problem? Maybe we can offer a prescription to fix it. Eleanor Mueller, what do you think?
So it's interesting because we have seen overwhelming anecdotal evidence of a worker shortage. We've obviously heard people in industries like food services and accommodations say that they are looking to hire people and they're not finding them. It's really interesting because when you break down the data at a national level, there's no evidence that we have a bigger worker shortage than we did before. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce actually put out an analysis last week that found that the ratio of available workers to job openings was about 1.2, which is what it was before COVID hit. So by employers' own measure, we are not seeing this nationwide. I think why it is getting so much more attention now is because it varies so greatly by sector. So, certain sectors are struggling much harder to find workers. I think that's disproportionately industries that are reopening abruptly. So, for example, restaurants, I think I feel like once you hear someone say unprecedented, you just like have to say it, but we could all do less with unprecedented. But I think that we have never before seen certain industries that shut down and then almost all simultaneously reopen and start looking for the same kinds of workers. So when you tie that into the fact that we have these supplemented unemployment benefits, we have some people who are still nervous about getting vaccinated, nervous about the pandemic. It's definitely exacerbated it for some sectors. We saw the chair of the Federal Reserve today actually listed supplemented unemployment benefits as a reason why we might be seeing a worker shortage. And I think the jury is still out on that. I mean, obviously, 24 Republican governors halted federally supplemented unemployment benefits in their states because they see it as the reason why there's a worker shortage. We simply don't. I mean, there's so many factors that we haven't had before. We haven't had unemployment benefits that have been this high. We haven't had a pandemic-induced recession since the beginning of the 20th century. And so I think a lot remains to be seen. But it's fascinating. I mean, talk about looking at what we're seeing in states. I think that this is an excellent example of a real-time economic experiment. We're going to know. I talked to an economist at Moody's earlier this week who said that by November, we should know whether or not these federal unemployment benefits were contributing to the worker shortage, because we'll have half the states that cut them off and half the states that didn't. And we can, look at their employment and see what the effect was. So, yeah.
I'm going to shift pretty wildly here. Did someone have a follow-up? No. Okay. Viewer Stan throws something into the ring here. Stan points to a big extension that is a 58 to 42 Senate vote of Davis-Bacon to the billions in new chip plant projects as part of the Endless Frontier Senate bill. This is the first new extension in over a decade. Stan also cites major wage and hour changes to prevailing wages are due to be coming by the fall. Any comments on this? I don't ride in this lane. I'm not familiar with this particular bit of legislation, but does anybody know what's going on here? No. Okay. Especially a specific question from Stan.
Well, I'll just jump in terms of the Davis-Bacon. I mean, I think Davis-Bacon has always been a little bit interesting in terms of, who's the coalition kind of supporting it, because it's really been most strongly important in the construction trades, which have always had a slightly different kind of role compared to the rest of organized labor, in the sense of, perhaps an in-between position between Republicans and Democrats and connections to the business community. We saw that with the Keystone XL pipeline, taking a very different position from others within the labor movement. Davis-Bacon's incredibly important to those unions. That's where Marty Walsh comes from. And it's an area where you can see business interests and labor interests coming into alignment around this. The business wants the support for industrial expansion in these areas. The unions, can deliver some political support, but this is a really crucial thing for them. And this is an area where I think, it's more traditional Davis-Bacon. Noam had an interesting earlier point about the question of, what this will mean in areas where the construction unions aren't strong, like solar panel installers, right? Where there isn't a prevailing union wage, right? We're talking about areas where there is a prevailing union wage, which is what they're defending. So I take this as kind of an indicator of one of the areas where the Biden administration's really pro-labor stance is probably making that difference, and they're delivering for some of their key supporters.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that question, viewer Stan. Good one. Mac Gowdy-Bacchus checks in the chat here, and we're going to switch gears yet again, where there's a lot to cover here. I think there's certainly a breadth of topics to address under this umbrella. Mac asks, is there data on the availability of childcare, especially affordable childcare, and how important is that to labor initiatives going forward? Do those two things figure into each other there? Any thoughts on that? Childcare as it relates
Absolutely, yes. I mean, when we talk about worker shortages, I think a big reason why a lot of people are currently unable to return to work is because of a lack of childcare, and that's what Biden would try and fix with these infrastructure plans. The American Families Plan, which is the quote unquote physical infrastructure plan, has money for childcare facilities, and the American Families Plan, which is the quote unquote soft infrastructure plan, has money for childcare workers and basically subsidized childcare. And all of that is built around Democratic legislation that senators and members of the House have been pushing for a while now. The numbers on childcare providers change pretty rapidly in terms of the availability of affordable services. But it's definitely still a problem. I mean, it's something that the sector was not doing well before COVID hit. And then it was one of the industries that was most decimated. And it is absolutely still crawling back. So it remains to be seen. I mean, that American Families Plan that has most of the childcare funding is the plan that is least likely to get any Republicans signed on to. And so I think that there's a lot up in the air right now in terms of what future aid we could see. But I do have some statistics on what we were seeing at the peak of the pandemic. 1 in 4 childcare facilities were actually closed in December. And at the height of the pandemic, 60% of childcare programs closed and 1/3 of childcare workers lost their jobs. So, I mean, that's pretty much unprecedented. It's crazy. And there's a huge racial disparity there as well, because over half of childcare facility owners are workers of color. Like 98% of childcare workers are women. And so the ramifications, I think, of letting this industry fall are pretty dramatic. But
yeah, thank you so much for that one. Now, I'm curious about your individualized experiences as reporters covering the pandemic. And I'm going to go around the horn here, if you don't mind. So, Lauren Cowrie-Gurley, let's come back to you. So, in your experience, anything kind of jump out at you? I know there's been a ton to report on, one crisis to another. What, in your mind, thinking back, have been maybe the most difficult, compelling, maybe even encouraging moments in the last 16 months or so for you?
Yeah, I think, throughout the whole pandemic, but especially in the beginning, there were so many people reaching out to us with tips about their employer, their work site, or, horrifying, horrible things going on, people dying, people's family members dying, like people with, I don't know, just like stuff that, I wanted to be able to cover everything, but also at the same time, the news cycle was moving so quickly that certain things happening at, Trader Joe's, that were really bad were also happening at every other grocery store. And it's like, how do you justify covering one thing over another, sort of? So I think that was really hard. I work on a tech desk at Vice, and, everyone sort of became a labor reporter during the pandemic. People were, there were just so many labor stories. So it was hard to cover, and then the things that were going on were hard to cover as well. I think, for most people, what I just saw was that, like, conditions that were already bad, like the things about them were bad, just got worse. And so it brought up a lot of problems that have been in workplace problems for a long time, in terms of health and safety, but in terms of, productivity standards, in terms of, wages, et cetera, benefits, sick days, et cetera, that, had always been a problem, became much worse. So I think just generally it was very draining, and to keep up with the news cycle, it felt like, you had to not cover a lot of things.
Noam Scheiber, I'm curious about your experience. Where did you find your reporting being drawn to? What has been your experience like in reporting?
It was pretty similar to Lauren's. It was just overwhelming at the beginning. And as Lauren said, everyone became a labor reporter. We had people covering, whole variety of businesses, tech, manufacturing, retail, all those reporters became labor reporters, basically just reporting on the situations that workers face in those sectors. I think over time, in the same way that a lot of reporters became labor reporters had to become other kinds of reporters. I spent a few months last summer and early fall just trying to understand testing and just both the science of it and why more employers weren't doing it, the economics of it, who it made sense, which employers were testing and why it made economic sense for them to test and which weren't and why it didn't, and the short answer was some employers, it just wasn't, some employers could survive outbreaks, basically. So to be really crass about it. So the economic hit from an outbreak wasn't off the charts and some could not. If you're, the NBA or a Hollywood production and you have an outbreak, you're done. But if you're, a big manufacturing facility and you have an outbreak, you can probably find replacement workers. You probably don't need to shut the whole thing down. So looking at kind of testing through a kind of brass tacks employer calculation was eye-opening. So that was definitely, kind of just learning these other things that labor reporters, workplace reporters don't normally think about, like testing was instructive. I think the other big high altitude thing that's really struck me, and it's kind of been a persistent theme throughout the reporting on the pandemic, is reconciling data, kind of macro level data, with what we hear from workers on the ground. And you have these moments where the people who are knee deep in the data will try to talk workers out of their anxiety or talk workers out of what they're feeling, but the workers on the ground probably have pretty good reason to be upset and scared and anxious. And one recent example of this is reporting that I did, a lot of other people did after the CDC changed its mask mandate in mid-May. They did that. It was very abrupt. It was out of the blue. Many employers abruptly changed their own mask policies in response. So you had retailers who had been very vigilant about requiring masking from customers and employees who, in the span of 12 or 24 hours, suddenly relaxed their mask mandates. A lot of workers, even vaccinated workers, were very concerned about this. Say nothing of unvaccinated workers. But I think people who are just looking at the data were saying, this is probably smart. The science supports it. As vaccination rates go up, infection rates go down, and, the risk is incredibly small if you're vaccinated. So, it's a tough line to walk. I mean, on one level, the data is the data. If you're vaccinated, the risks are pretty small. On the other hand, the data doesn't tell the full story. We know from the various vaccine trials that the vaccines are incredibly effective, but we don't know everything about their effectiveness. We don't know if they're super effective if you're surrounded by people who are unmasked and potentially infected all the time. So that balance between data and what we're actually hearing from workers on the ground was hard to strike, and I think we kind of still struggle with it to this day.
Hey, Smith, any similarities or differences in what you experienced through the pandemic reporting on labor?
Definitely. I think overwhelming is a great way to describe it throughout, and it continues to be. Nothing has changed in that area. I think that from my perspective, reporting for Bloomberg Law and having sort of a baseline knowledge of employment laws really helped, at least going into the pandemic, and trying to sort of learn how employers legally can grapple with all of these unanswered questions, right? I think it is really interesting that I still get emails about sort of just basic explainer articles I did throughout the reporting of if my employer has a mask mandate, do I have to, legally, do I have to abide by that? And it's just, these are questions that workers have never really had to grapple with and are really, there's just an undercurrent of uncertainty and fear and just it's been throughout the time because it's a global pandemic and there are workers who are reporting to work every day and have all of these unanswered questions. So to your original question of, what has it been like covering this? It's just been constant. And it is really heartbreaking when you hear stories from workers who reach out to you and ask these questions and, provide anecdotes of just horrific experiences either in their workplace or in their personal lives. And yeah, as Lauren said, having to, sort of carry on and report on other things is has been really challenging, but it is sort of important to, remain rooted in data and to, in our case as well, remain rooted in the law and try to tell stories in the, most truthful way possible. So that's been really challenging, and it's been very overwhelming throughout, I would say.
Eleanor Mueller, what has being overwhelmed been like for you over at the Politico News Desk?
Well, I'll put it this way. We have a labor newsletter that goes out 3 times a week, and it has a 1,500 word count. And we end up cutting like 4 items every single day. I mean, it's just, there's more news than I think anyone really knows what to do with, and so much of it feels so important. And so it's really hard as a reporter to constantly be picking and choosing what you can and can't spend your time on. Mm-hmm. I think what also has been hard, at least for me, has been speaking with workers who are receiving jobless benefits, especially in December when a lot of workers were looking at that unemployment cliff. And then again this month when so many of these Republican-led states are looking at losing their benefits. I mean, you talk to people who are choosing not to pay their power bill because in the state they're in, you can't cut off someone's power after November, or a mother of 8 who's gone back to work that she can only get 6 hours at her job. And, once Florida ends their federal unemployment benefits, she's not going to get any money, and she's going to be relying solely on 6 hours of minimum wage. Those stories are tough, because you can't really do anything except say, thank you for sharing. But yeah.
Dean Alex, let's get into the prognostication. Let's look out into the future, right? So we've heard the breadth of experience and perspectives of each of our reporters here, and their individualized experience in covering labor over the pandemic. What do you see as some of the most important issues, factors driving the future of labor going forward, Dean Alex?
Yeah. So I think one of the things this pandemic has shown is that kind of refocusing on the importance of work in individuals' lives. I think the workplace is the battlefield in which a lot of stuff has played out this year in terms of where people have been fears of infection and worry, but then also that kind of balancing of their lives, of sort of work and family, and this plays out centrally in people's lives, and also this kind of ongoing changing nature of work, right? It's really striking to me, if we had done this panel 5 years ago, I think we might have been guessing like 5 years from now, we'd be talking about self-driving trucks and cars. That was going to be the thing transforming things. And it turns out, no, we're doing this thing over Zoom, and technology is transforming our work in this totally different kind of way. And we're working from home and all these kind of strange things that I don't think we expected a couple of years ago. So I think that kind of ongoing kind of transformation of work is a process we're just going to see playing out. And I think we've seen sort of an uncertainty to it, but there's some eternal kind of issues we keep coming back to, that this matters in terms of people's social and economic lives, that we keep coming back to those issues.
And here we are. It's 2 minutes after the hour. We could have gone on forever. I feel like we just got momentum and liftoff here. I want to thank you, Eleanor, Lauren, Paige, Noam, and Dean Alex for the conversation today. And I also want to thank our audience members. We had some great questions come in. We just couldn't fit everything in today. But I appreciate everyone joining us. I hope that you were able to access some of those resources and articles that we shared in the chat today, because that certainly augments our conversation and features pieces by our very writers and reporters here. So again, thanks everybody for joining. Stay strong, stay safe. We'll see you at the next keynote, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today as well. Thank you so much.